For nearly 2 decades, one man controlled more of New York City than any mayor or police commissioner ever could. He didn't give speeches or hold press conferences. He didn't run for office or appear on television. Most New Yorkers never knew his name. Yet every day, millions of dollars flowed through his organization. This invisible emperor of the underworld was Carlo Gambino, and his family would become the most powerful criminal organization America has ever known. On a sweltering summer day in 1902, in the ancient Sicilian city of Palermo, a boy was born who would one day reshape organized crime in America forever. The exact date remains uncertain. Historians disagree whether it was August 24th or September 1st, but what matters is that Carlo Gambino entered a world already steeped in the traditions of the mafia. Palermo wasn't just any city. For centuries, it had been the birthplace of powerful mafia bosses, a place where the honored society had been a law unto themselves, so dominant that even police and military forces dared not enter certain neighborhoods. Carlo's parents, Tommaso Gambino and Felice Castellano, had given their son something most aspiring criminals could only dream of: connections. His mother's family, the Castellanos, were already deeply involved in mafia operations both in Sicily and across the ocean in New York City. This wasn't just helpful, it was transformative. While other young men had to fight and claw their way into the criminal underworld, Carlo had a path already laid before him. As a teenager, Carlo watched the men of respect stroll through Palermo's streets in their beautifully tailored suits. These weren't just criminals. They were treated like royalty. Men would remove their hats in deference. Women would curtsy and kiss their hands. Young Carlo looked at these powerful figures and thought to himself, how can he get to be one of these guys? The question wasn't whether he would join the honored society, but how quickly he could rise through its ranks. Carlo proved himself to be exactly what the mafia valued most: a hard worker, smart, eager to please, and most importantly, someone who could keep his mouth shut. By the time he was 19 years old in 1921, he had already been inducted into the honored society after swearing a blood oath never to betray the brotherhood. But Sicily, for all its mafia tradition, was becoming too small for Carlo's ambitions. That same year, in November 1921, he climbed aboard the SS Vincenzo Florio as a stowaway, leaving behind everything he knew for the promise of America. When Carlo arrived in Brooklyn, he settled in a neighborhood already thick with Sicilian immigrants and mafia influence. America in the 1920s was a land of opportunity for men like Carlo, not because of legitimate business, but because of a monumental mistake the government had just made. Prohibition had outlawed alcohol across the entire country, and the public was thirsty for illegal booze. All over America, organized crime was supplying it and reaping enormous profits. Carlo's first cousins, the Castellanos, were among New York's busiest bootleggers. They had a small trucking business, and like many other small trucking operations, their trucks were used to transport illegal alcohol. Carlo became both a driver and sometimes a shotgun guard because different bootleg operations would hijack each other's trucks. This was dangerous work, but it paid well, and more importantly, it taught Carlo the fundamentals of organized criminal enterprise. Through his bootlegging work, Carlo caught the attention of one of New York's major mafia leaders, Joe the Boss Masseria. This old-time Sicilian man of respect ran a significant bootlegging racket. Carlo, always sensing opportunities to advance himself, went to work for Masseria. He quickly proved himself to be an acute businessman and organizer, becoming indispensable to whoever employed him. But Carlo had a quality that would define his entire career. He was treacherous at heart. He understood something crucial that many other mobsters missed. Clinging to a single boss could mark you for death by a rival gang. In the treacherous world of organized crime, loyalty was often a liability. Carlo's driving ambition left no room for lasting devotion to anyone, including Joe the Boss. This cold calculation would soon be tested in one of the bloodiest conflicts in mafia history. In the early 1930s, Carlo's boss found himself locked in a vicious turf war with a longtime Sicilian rival named Salvatore Maranzano. This conflict, known as the Castellamarese War, was tearing the mafia apart. Bodies were dropping on both sides. The younger gangsters, including Carlo, watched this old-world vendetta with growing frustration. One of Carlo's friends, an ambitious young mobster named Lucky Luciano, devised a clever plan to eliminate Joe the Boss. Lucky approached Carlo with a proposition. He told Carlo he had an option: come with us and be on the winning side. This was the moment that would define Carlo's career. He could remain loyal to his boss and possibly die with him, or he could betray Masseria and position himself for future leadership. Carlo, ever the pragmatist, quietly supported Lucky's plan. In doing so, he demonstrated the cunning that would characterize his entire life, achieving his goals with minimal personal risk while letting others take the dangerous action. On April 15, 1931, Joe Masseria was lured to a restaurant in Coney Island for what he thought was a friendly meal with Lucky Luciano. After lunch, while Masseria sat at the table, assassins entered and shot him dead. Carlo wasn't the triggerman, but he had helped make the murder possible. With Masseria eliminated, the path seemed clear for Maranzano to take control of all New York Mafia operations. Maranzano moved quickly to reorganize the Mafia's power structure. He recognized the groups that would become the five families, then known as the Luciano, Galliano, Mangano, Maranzano, and Profaci outfits, and divided New York's criminal territories among them. Each family now had a clear hierarchy: a boss, an underboss, lieutenants, and soldiers. Maranzano declared himself capo di tutti I capi, boss of all bosses, essentially making himself the supreme authority of the Mafia. But Maranzano's reign would be remarkably short. Later in 1931, just months after consolidating power, Lucky Luciano had Maranzano murdered. Luciano then organized the commission, which initially consisted of the heads of the five families, the Buffalo Mafia, and the Chicago outfit. This new structure would govern organized crime for decades to come. Instead of one all-powerful boss, there would be a council of equals, at least in theory. Carlo Gambino found himself working under the Mangano crime family, led by Vincent Mangano. For the next 2 decades, Carlo methodically built his reputation and power within the organization. He married his cousin, Catherine Castellano, in 1932, and the couple eventually had 4 children together. On the surface, Carlo appeared to be building a normal American life. In reality, he was constructing a criminal empire. His path wasn't entirely smooth. Throughout the 1930s, Carlo had multiple run-ins with the law. He was first arrested in 1930 in Lawrence, Massachusetts, as a suspicious person, though he was released without charge. Later that year, he caught a larceny charge in Brockton, then failed to appear in court, resulting in an arrest warrant. When he was finally arrested for that charge 4 years later, he made a restitution of $1,000 and the charge was dropped. In 1937, Carlo's luck ran out, at least temporarily. He was found guilty of alcohol tax evasion in Philadelphia and sentenced to 22 months in the federal penitentiary at Lewisburg, Pennsylvania. This would prove to be the only time in his 50-year criminal career that he would spend behind bars. Even this setback, Carlo turned into a learning experience. He emerged from prison more cautious, more calculated, and more determined than ever to never return. The 1940s brought new opportunities. While World War II upended the lives of millions of Americans, Carlo made a fortune selling ration stamps that he bought from corrupt officials with the Office of Price Administration. He invested his illegal profits wisely, diversifying into restaurants, nightclubs, bakeries, factories, meat markets, olive oil importers, trucking companies, and pizza parlors. By the end of the decade, he was among the richest members of the Mangano crime family. But wealth without power meant little in the Mafia world. Vincent Mangano, the family boss, disappeared in April 1951 under mysterious circumstances. His body was never found. His brother Philip's corpse was discovered soon after. The most likely suspect was Albert Anastasia, head of the notorious Murder Incorporated organization. Anastasia took over as boss, but his violent temperament would eventually be his undoing. Carlo watched and waited. He understood that in the Mafia, patience was often more valuable than aggression. Anastasia's reign was marked by unnecessary violence and poor judgment. Carlo quietly began positioning himself, building relationships with other families, demonstrating his business acumen and his ability to earn money without drawing unwanted attention. The opportunity Carlo had been waiting for arrived in 1957. On October 25th, Albert Anastasia walked into the barbershop of the Park Sheraton Hotel in Manhattan for a haircut and shave. As he sat in the barber's chair with hot towels covering his face, two gunmen entered and shot him dead. The murder was allegedly carried out with the approval of Vito Genovese, another powerful mob boss. Within days, Carlo Gambino inherited leadership of the crime family. He was 55 years old, and he had spent nearly 4 decades preparing for this moment. The family that had once belonged to the Manganos, then to Anastasia, would now bear his name, the Gambino crime family. He had connived and killed his way to the top, but he had done so with remarkable patience and cunning. As the new boss, Carlo immediately set about expanding and consolidating his power. The family already controlled the Brooklyn waterfront, extracting tribute from longshoremen and dock workers. But Carlo understood that diversification was the key to lasting wealth and power. He expanded operations into gambling, construction bid rigging, loan sharking, and even securities fraud on Wall Street. No corner of New York's economy was too small or too large for the Gambino family's attention. Carlo's approach to leadership was revolutionary in the mafia world. While other bosses sought publicity and respect through displays of wealth and power, Carlo deliberately cultivated an image of modesty. He lived in a modest home, dressed conservatively, and avoided the spotlight at all costs. Traditional mafia leaders led publicity-shy lives, and Carlo epitomized this approach. He understood what many of his contemporaries did not. In the modern world, visibility meant vulnerability. His personality was perfectly suited to this strategy. Carlo rarely raised his voice. He never made threats he didn't intend to keep. Associates described him as soft-spoken and courteous, almost professorial in his demeanor. But beneath this gentle exterior was a man capable of ordering murders without hesitation. Carlo understood that fear was most effective when it didn't need to be constantly demonstrated. In 1962, Carlo used family bloodlines to further cement his power. He arranged for his son to marry the daughter of Thomas Lucchese, boss of another one of the 5 families. This alliance strengthened the Gambino family's position within the commission and demonstrated Carlo's understanding that in the mafia, family ties were often more reliable than mere business relationships. Throughout the 1960s and early 1970s, Carlo Gambino reputedly became known as the boss of bosses. The Gambino family became extremely powerful under his leadership. They had major interests in Brooklyn and controlled significant portions of the city's labor unions, particularly waterfront unions. Carlo's influence extended far beyond New York. The Gambino family had operations in New Jersey, Florida, and even international connections. What made Carlo particularly effective was his ability to adapt to changing circumstances. When federal law enforcement began cracking down on traditional mafia activities, Carlo shifted strategies. He became more cautious about whom he trusted, more careful about what he said on the telephone, and more sophisticated about hiding the family's income. He understood that the old ways, the open displays of power that characterized earlier mafia bosses, were becoming increasingly dangerous in an era of electronic surveillance and aggressive prosecution. Carlo's success wasn't just about criminal activity, it was about understanding human nature. He knew how to inspire loyalty in his subordinates, not just through fear, but through respect and financial reward. He knew how to negotiate with rival families, finding solutions that left everyone feeling they had gained something. He knew how to corrupt officials, not through crude bribery, but through careful cultivation of relationships over years. The federal government was well aware of Carlo Gambino's activities. In 1970, he was indicted for hijacking. That same year, the U.S. Supreme Court upheld an order for his deportation because of his illegal entry into the country back in 1921. But Carlo's body betrayed him where his enemies could not. He suffered severe heart attacks that deferred both his trial and his deportation. Over the following years, Carlo's health continued to deteriorate. More heart seizures weakened him progressively. Yet even from his sickbed, he continued to run the family's operations, making decisions and settling disputes. On October 15, 1976, at his home in Massapequa, New York, Carlo Gambino died of natural causes. He was 74 years old. In 50 years of crime, Carlo had served only those 22 months in prison. Back in 1937, he had survived multiple mafia wars. He had outlasted dozens of rivals. He had built the most powerful crime family in America, and he had done it all while remaining largely unknown to the general public. When most Americans heard his name in the news after his death, they had no idea who he was or what he had accomplished. Carlo's death might have marked the end of his personal story. But the Gambino family was far from finished. In fact, the family's most publicly visible era was about to begin under a man who represented everything Carlo was not. After Carlo's death, leadership eventually passed to Paul Castellano, Carlo's brother-in-law. Castellano continued Carlo's approach of quiet business operations and avoiding publicity. But on December 16, 1985, Castellano and his underboss, Thomas Bilotti, were shot dead outside Sparks Steakhouse in Manhattan during rush hour in the busy holiday season. This brazen double murder was major news and is still considered one of the most audacious mafia hits ever in New York City. The assassination was orchestrated by John Gotti, who rose to become the new Gambino family boss. Where Carlo had been quiet and careful, Gotti was flamboyant and publicity-hungry. He reveled in media attention as the boss of the nation's largest and most influential organized crime group. Gotti cut a colorful figure in New York City, dining in elegant restaurants and night spots surrounded by bodyguards. The press called him the Dapper Don for his expensive suits and public persona. Gotti's approach was the exact opposite of Carlo's philosophy, and it brought predictable results. The intense media scrutiny and Gotti's high profile made him a priority target for federal prosecutors. In 1992, Gotti was convicted of various crimes, including Castellano's murder, and sentenced to life in prison. He died in 2002 at age 61 of cancer in a federal prison hospital. The Gambino family's visibility under Gotti attracted unprecedented law enforcement attention. The RICO Act, enacted in 1970, proved hugely effective in combating organized crime. The law allowed prosecutors to target entire criminal organizations rather than just individual criminals. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, numerous convictions decimated the leadership of all five families. The prospect of lengthy prison sentences led many mafia members to become informants, further weakening the organizations. After Gotti's imprisonment and eventual death, the Gambino family learned from these mistakes and returned to Carlo's original approach. Stay quiet, avoid publicity, and focus on making money. Leadership changed several times, with Frank Cali reputedly serving as boss from 2015 until his murder in 2019. On March 13, 2019, Francesco "Frankie Boy" Cali was shot to death outside his home on Staten Island. A pickup truck hit his parked SUV, and when Cali went outside to investigate, he was gunned down. News stories about his high-ranking position surprised many people because Cali had successfully maintained a low profile. Nobody knew he was the boss, exactly as Carlo would have wanted. The Gambino family continued operating in the shadows, just as Carlo had taught them. They had been wounded by decades of prosecutions, but not mortally. No one had driven a spike through their heart. They adapted to changing times, finding new ways to make money as old rackets became more difficult or less profitable. In 2025, the Gambino family made headlines again, but this time they weren't alone. Federal prosecutors indicted 13 members and associates of 4 of the 5 families, including the Gambinos, in connection with an elaborate gambling scheme. The operation allegedly involved rigged poker games that began as early as 2019. Victims were lured by the presence of celebrities, including former NBA players. One victim lost $1.8 million in the manufactured gambling matches. What's remarkable about this recent case is that it demonstrated the five families were still cooperating, still operating, still finding ways to extract money from illegal activities. The Gambino, Bonanno, Lucchese, and Genovese families were all allegedly involved. This complex scheme was so far-reaching that it included members from 4 organized crime families. And when people refused to pay because they were cheated, the defendants used threats, intimidation, and violence. The modern Gambino family bears little resemblance to the organization Carlo built at its height. They've lost control of much of the construction industry and development projects. They no longer build major facilities like the Jacob Javits Center. Many of the unions and small businesses they once controlled have been bought out by larger corporations, loosening the mafia's grip on New York City. Yet they persist. The mafia world remains a carbon copy of capitalism. People in that environment continue to figure out ways to make money. If they can't profit from gambling, they increase drug trafficking. If one racket becomes too risky, they find another. The fundamental skills that made the Gambino family powerful, intimidation, organization, the willingness to use violence, remain valuable in the criminal underworld. Looking back at Carlo Gambino's life and legacy, what's most striking isn't the violence or the crimes, though there were plenty of both. It's the remarkable intelligence and patience he displayed throughout his career. From the moment he arrived in America as a teenage stowaway to his death as the most powerful mob boss in the country, Carlo demonstrated an almost supernatural ability to read situations and people. He understood when to act and when to wait. He knew when to use violence and when persuasion was more effective. He recognized that true power often meant remaining invisible while others sought the spotlight. He built an organization that survived decades of law enforcement pressure and internal conflicts. But here's what often gets lost in discussions of Carlo Gambino and the crime family that bears his name. For all his intelligence, for all his success, for all his power, Carlo Gambino was fundamentally a destroyer, not a builder. He didn't create legitimate businesses or contribute positively to society. He corrupted labor unions that were meant to protect workers. He fixed construction bids that drove up costs for everyone. He ran loan sharking operations that destroyed families. He ordered murders of people who stood in his way. The neighborhoods he controlled weren't better off because of his influence. They were worse. The dock workers who paid him tribute weren't protected. They were exploited. The businesses that paid him protection money weren't safe. They were prisoners of an illegal system. Every dollar Carlo Gambino earned came from someone else's suffering or society's harm. And perhaps most tragically, Carlo's success inspired generations of young men to follow his path. Boys growing up in Italian-American neighborhoods in Brooklyn and Queens looked at the men of respect the same way young Carlo once looked at the mafiosi in Palermo. They saw the nice clothes, the respect, the money. They didn't see the violence, the betrayals, the paranoia, the prison cells, and the early graves. Today, the Gambino family continues to exist, a shadow of its former power, but still operating, still criminal, still destructive. The men running it now never knew Carlo Gambino personally, but they've inherited his legacy. They use his name, occupy his organizational structure, and operate according to principles he established. They tell themselves they're men of honor, part of a tradition stretching back centuries to Sicily, but the truth is simpler and sadder. They're criminals. They steal and threaten and sometimes kill to make money. They contribute nothing of value to society while taking whatever they can. They hurt people and communities and call it business. They corrupt institutions meant to serve the public good and call it power. Carlo Gambino died peacefully in his bed, having avoided prison for nearly all his adult life. Having built one of the most powerful criminal organizations in American history, having achieved everything he set out to accomplish. By any measure a criminal might use, his life was an extraordinary success, yet what did he really leave behind? A crime family that continues to hurt people for profit. A legacy of violence and corruption. A cautionary tale about how intelligence and ambition, when devoted to purely selfish ends, can cause immense harm while appearing superficially impressive. The story of Carlo Gambino isn't really about crime or the mafia or New York City in the 20th century. It's about a more fundamental human question: what do we do with our talents and our time? Carlo Gambino had extraordinary abilities. He could read people, plan strategically, lead effectively, and inspire loyalty. In a different life, with different choices, those same skills could have built something positive, something lasting, something that made the world better rather than worse. Instead, he chose to build an empire of fear and exploitation. He died wealthy and powerful, having never faced real consequences for his crimes. And somewhere in Brooklyn or Queens or Staten Island right now, there's probably a young man looking at the remnants of what Carlo built, seeing the surface appeal of easy money and respect through fear, not understanding that the real cost of that life is measured not in prison time or violent death, though those risks are real, but in the simple fact that at the end, no matter how successful you become, you've spent your one chance at existence making the world worse instead of better. That's the real tragedy of the Gambino crime family. Not that they were criminals, but that they were humans who chose again and again, day after day, to use their limited time on Earth to hurt others for personal gain. Carlo Gambino controlled New York City without anyone knowing, and in the end, that control meant nothing at all.